At the very beginning, when you disappear, the first emotion she feels isn't pain, it's relief. The emotional noise quiets down. The pressure of expectations fades. There are no messages to respond to, no conversations to navigate, no emotional responsibility placed on her anymore. In her mind, this silence confirms what you told herself before you left, that space was needed, that distance would bring clarity, that losing you wasn't really a loss at all. She leans into that feeling and allows herself to breathe, believing she has regained control of the situation. During these first few days, she tells herself she's fine. She fills her time with distractions, friends, routines, and familiar comforts. She may even feel lighter, more independent, more certain that things are better this way. But even as she convinces herself of that narrative, something subtle begins to happen beneath the surface. The silence feels different than she expected. It's not dramatic, it's not painful, it's just noticeable. The absence doesn't demand attention yet, but it quietly takes up space in her mind. She starts becoming aware of the gaps. Moments when she would normally check her phone. Times when a message from you would usually arrive without effort. She doesn't miss you emotionally yet, but she notices the change. And that awareness plants the first seed. The human mind is deeply wired to patterns, and when a familiar presence disappears without warning or explanation, curiosity naturally replaces certainty. Not because she wants you back, but because something feels unfinished. As the days pass, curiosity grows in small, almost unspoken ways. She wonders why you haven't reached out. She expected a message, a reaction, some emotional response. Even if she believed she wanted space, a part of her still assumed you'd try. When you don't, it subtly disrupts the internal balance. A silence doesn't hurt, but it challenges her assumptions. And that's where the shift begins. She starts asking questions she didn't expect to ask. Is he busy? Is he pulling away intentionally? Did he accept this more easily than she thought? These questions aren't rooted in longing, yet they're rooted in surprise. She isn't chasing answers, but her mind revisits them when she's alone. When distractions fade at night, when routines slow down, the absence begins to feel deliberate rather than accidental. What makes this phase powerful is that nothing emotional has been triggered, yet only awareness. And awareness is dangerous because it removes comfort. She can't label your disappearance as weakness, desperation, or emotional instability. You didn't argue, you didn't plead, you didn't explain yourself. You simply went silent. And silence, when unexpected, forces the mind to fill in the blanks. In these early days, she still believes she's in control. She believes if she wanted, she could reach out and reestablish contact. That belief keeps her calm. But the longer the silence continues, the more that belief quietly weakens. Control feels less certain when the other person isn't reacting the way you anticipated, and without realizing it, her emotional position begins to shift. This is the stage where your disappearance starts working on a psychological level, not because she misses you, but because she can't fully understand you anymore. You are no longer predictable, and unpredictability creates intrigue. The absence becomes noticeable not as a loss, but as a question mark, a pause in the story she thought she understood. And while she won't admit it, the first emotional shift has already happened. Because the moment she starts wondering why you're gone instead of assuming you'll return, the dynamic has changed. As the days continue to pass, something subtle but important begins to take over. Her ego steps into the foreground. By now, the initial relief has settled into a quiet expectation. She still believes you'll return, not because she desperately wants you to, but because she assumes it. In her mind, this is how these situations usually go. Men come back, men explain, men reach out when the silence becomes uncomfortable. And because you haven't yet, she treats your absence as temporary, almost like a delayed response rather than a real decision. During this phase, she starts checking her phone more often, not out of longing, but out of anticipation. She expects your name to appear eventually. A message, a question, an emotional opening. Even a casual check-in would confirm what she believes, that you're still emotionally tethered, still available, still waiting for the right moment to reinsert yourself into her life. That expectation gives her a sense of security. It reassures her that she still holds the emotional leverage. She may talk about you casually to friends, downplaying the separation. She frames it as distance, not loss. She might even say things like, "He'll reach out eventually," with a tone that suggests confidence rather than hope. This isn't arrogance, it's conditioning. Past experiences have taught her that attention usually returns. Silence is often followed by pursuit. And so she waits, not anxiously, but comfortably. But as more time passes, the comfort begins to erode. Each day without contact chips away at the certainty she once felt. The expectation doesn't vanish all at once, it weakens gradually. At first, she dismisses it. Maybe you're busy. Maybe you're giving space. Maybe you're giving space. Maybe you're just waiting. But the lack of emotional cues becomes harder to rationalize. There's no breadcrumb, no accidental interaction, no indirect reminder that you're still emotionally invested. This is when her ego starts to feel challenged, not wounded, challenged. Because if you don't return when expected, it raises an uncomfortable possibility that you chose not to. And that idea directly contradicts the narrative she's been telling herself. If you don't chase, it means she may not have had the level of influence she believed. And ego doesn't like unanswered questions that threaten self-perception. She begins replaying subtle moments in her mind, looking for clues she may have missed. Did you seem more detached toward the end? Did you stop reacting emotionally before disappearing? Did you accept things too easily? These thoughts aren't emotional yet, they're analytical. She's trying to regain a sense of understanding, a sense of control over the story, but the more she thinks, the less clarity she finds. What intensifies this phase is the absence of reassurance. You didn't leave behind emotional loose ends. You didn't promise to stay in touch. You didn't express lingering attachment. That clean break removes the emotional safety net, and without it, her expectation starts turning into uncertainty. The ego that once felt comfortable now feels slightly exposed. She may even feel a brief urge to test the silence, posting something, being more visible, or subtly seeking attention just to see if it triggers a response from you. Not because she wants you back, but because she wants confirmation. And when nothing happens, the silence becomes louder. The absence starts to feel intentional rather than circumstantial. By the absence starts to feel intentional rather than circumstantial. By the end of this phase, the belief that you'll return is no longer solid, it's conditional. She still thinks it might happen, but she's no longer sure when or why. And that uncertainty shifts the emotional balance. Because the moment she starts waiting without confidence, the power dynamic quietly changes, setting the stage for doubt to take over next. As time moves forward, the confidence she once had begins to dissolve, and in its place, doubt quietly settles in. This is no longer about expecting you to return or assuming the silence is temporary. Now the absence has lasted long enough to feel real. The certainty that once kept her emotionally steady starts to weaken, and the mind naturally turns inward when external reassurance disappears. This is where the emotional tone truly begins to shift. She starts replaying moments not obsessively but thoughtfully. Conversations resurface. Small details gain weight. The way you listened without needing to prove anything. The calm presence you carried. The consistency that once felt ordinary now feels rare. At the time, those qualities may not have stood out because they were steady, predictable, and secure. But in your absence, they begin to contrast sharply with the emotional noise around her. What makes this stage powerful is that it isn't driven by longing, yet it's driven by reevaluation. She begins questioning the story she told herself early on. The idea that losing you was easy. The belief that your presence was replaceable. The assumption that you were more invested than she was. One by one, those assumptions start cracking under the weight of silence. She wonders if she misjudged your value. Not just emotionally, but psychologically. She realizes you didn't disappear impulsively. You didn't vanish in a moment of weakness. The longer the silence lasts, the more intentional it feels, and intention carries meaning. It suggests self-control. It suggests self-control. It suggests self-respect. It suggests a man who knows when to step away instead of fighting to stay. This realization creates internal conflict. On one hand, she doesn't want to believe she underestimated you. On the other, the evidence keeps accumulating. You didn't check in. You didn't seek validation. You didn't react emotionally. And that absence of reaction becomes louder than any argument ever could. It forces her to confront the possibility she hadn't considered, that you may have accepted the loss more fully than she did. She begins comparing her emotional state to yours, even without knowing what you're actually feeling. And in that comparison, she feels a subtle imbalance. She's thinking, reflecting, wondering, while you appear unmoved. That perceived calm shifts the emotional weight. It places you in a position of quiet strength and leaves her questioning her own emotional clarity. This is also the stage where doubt turns personal. She asks herself if she contributed to the distance more than she admitted, if she pushed boundaries, if she took emotional availability for granted. These thoughts don't lead to guilt yet, but they lead to humility. And humility is the beginning of emotional awareness. The absence now feels heavier, not because she misses you intensely, but because she can no longer dismiss what you represented. Your presence had an emotional grounding effect that she didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. And now, without that grounding, she feels slightly unsettled, not lost, but unsteady. By this point, the question in her mind has changed. It's no longer, when will he reach out? It becomes, what if he doesn't? And that single shift reframes everything. Because once the possibility of permanence enters the mind, the emotional landscape changes completely. This is where doubt fully replaces confidence. And once that happens, the dynamic is no longer in her favor, because the one who doubts is no longer in control. As more time passes, her emotional focus begins to shift outward, not because she's moved on, but because she's trying to. This is a stage where comparison quietly takes over. She engages more with other people, accepts attention, entertains conversations, and places herself in situations meant to remind her that options still exist. On the surface, it looks like progress, but emotionally, it's something else entirely. It's an attempt to fill a space that has become harder to ignore. At first, the interactions seem promising. Compliments come easily. Interest is obvious. Attention feels accessible. But very quickly, she notices the difference. The conversations lack depth. The connection feels rushed or performative. There's enthusiasm, but not understanding. Interest, but not presence. And in those moments of contrast, your absence becomes more defined, not as loneliness, but as emotional clarity. She starts measuring without intending to. How easy it was to talk to you. How safe it felt to be herself around you. How she didn't need to explain every emotion or defend every silence. Those qualities weren't dramatic, so they didn't stand out before. But now, surrounded by shallow engagement and inconsistent energy, the emotional standard quietly shifts upward, and that shift pulls her inward. This is when she begins to emotionally withdraw from distractions. Not all at once, but gradually. She becomes less impressed by attention and less fulfilled by surface level connection. The excitement she expected to feel doesn't last. Instead, there's a lingering sense of emotional mismatch. Something feels off, even when everything looks fine on paper. She may find herself thinking about you during moments she didn't anticipate, while laughing with someone else during quiet evenings, or when a conversation falls flat. Not because she's comparing people directly, but because your presence created a baseline she can't ignore. The absence now has weight. It's no longer just silence, it's contrast. What deepens this stage is the realization that emotional chemistry can't be forced. She can't recreate what was lost by simply replacing it, and that realization brings discomfort. Because if connection isn't interchangeable, then what you shared wasn't ordinary. And if it wasn't ordinary, then letting it go wasn't as simple as she once believed. At the same time, she pulls back internally. She becomes more reflective, more reserved, less expressive about her emotions. Friends may notice a change even if they can't name it. She's present, but not fully engaged. Smiling, but not fulfilled. The emotional stimulation she sought doesn't deliver the grounding she expected. This withdrawal isn't sadness, it's recognition. Recognition that something meaningful is missing even if she doesn't want to label it as loss. She starts understanding that your value wasn't in constant excitement or emotional highs, but in consistency. And consistency, once removed, is hard to replace. By now, your absence carries emotional authority. You are no longer just someone who left. You are the standard by which she measures what follows. And that realization quietly shifts her emotional orientation, pulling her away from distractions and back toward reflection. This is the phase where the silence stops being empty and starts becoming instructive. As time stretches further, something deeper begins to surface. Not sudden pain, not dramatic longing, but regret shaped by clarity. This is the stage where reflection turns inward in a more honest way. The distractions have lost their effectiveness, the comparisons have done their job, and now there's nowhere left to hide from the quiet truth forming beneath the surface. She starts examining not just what was lost, but how it was lost. Her thoughts shift from evaluating you to evaluating herself. She replays situations with new perspective, noticing moments where she may have assumed too much, expected without appreciating, or tested boundaries without realizing the cost. Things she once justified now feel less certain, not because she suddenly blames herself, but because emotional distance allows clarity to replace defensiveness. What makes this phase different from earlier doubt is the tone. There's no ego left to protect. The confidence that once shielded her from discomfort has softened. She isn't asking whether you'll come back anymore. She's asking whether things could have been different if she had shown up differently. And that question carries weight because it implies value she didn't fully acknowledge when it was present. Your disappearance now feels intentional and controlled, not reactive. She sees that you didn't leave to punish her or provoke emotion. You left to preserve something within yourself, and that realization reframes everything. It transforms your silence from absence into boundary, and boundaries command respect, especially when they're upheld without anger or explanation. She begins to understand that your detachment wasn't emotional weakness, it was emotional discipline. You didn't argue to stay relevant. You didn't negotiate your worth. You didn't collapse under uncertainty. You chose self-respect over reassurance. And in that choice, she now sees strength she may have overlooked when it was quietly present. This is also the point where regret becomes nuanced. It's not just about losing you, it's about losing access to the version of herself she was when she felt grounded, seen, and emotionally steady. Your presence wasn't just comforting, it reflected something stable back to her. And without that reflection, she feels the difference. She may feel a subtle urge to reach out, not impulsively, not emotionally, but thoughtfully. Not to reclaim control, but to reconnect with something unfinished. But even that urge comes with hesitation, because by now she understands the dynamic has changed. You're no longer someone waiting on the other side of silence. You're someone who chose to walk away with dignity. What makes this realization heavy is that it can't be undone easily. Respect, once lost, can be regained, but only through growth, not explanation. And she senses that if she were to reach out, it would have to come from humility, not entitlement. That awareness alone shows how far the emotional shift has gone. By this stage, regret isn't loud, it's steady. It sits quietly in the background, influencing how she thinks, how she feels, and how she views connection going forward. And whether she ever expresses it or not, the understanding is now permanent. Because once someone realizes they didn't lose you due to circumstances, but due to misjudgment, the memory never fades. By the time everything settles, the emotional shift is complete. There is no longer confusion, comparison, or quiet regret fighting for space in her mind. What remains is understanding, not the kind that demands action, but the kind that permanently reframes how she sees you. Your absence has transformed into a presence one that exists not through contact, but through impact. She now recognizes that your silence was never empty. It was intentional, composed, and self-directed. You didn't disappear to create drama or force a reaction. You didn't vanish hoping she'd panic or chase. You simply stepped away and allowed reality to unfold without interference. And in doing so, you communicated something more powerful than words ever could. You know your worth, and you don't abandon yourself to be chosen. At this stage, she understands that everything she felt along the way, relief, expectation, doubt, comparison, regret, was part of a process she couldn't rush or avoid. Your absence forced her to confront emotional truths she might have never faced if you had stayed accessible. And whether she likes that realization or not, she respects it. Because growth often arrives through loss, and clarity often comes from silence. She may wonder if reaching out is still an option. But now, that question carries weight. It's no longer about curiosity or reassurance. It's about whether she's willing to meet you at a different level one, rooted in mutual respect rather than emotional leverage. And she knows that if she were to reach out, it wouldn't be met by desperation or resentment. It would be met by desperation or resentment. It would be met by calm discernment. And that changes everything. Even if she never reaches out, the imprint remains. You become a reference point in her emotional memory, not the one who begged, not the one who lingered, but the one who walked away without hostility, without explanation, and without losing himself. That kind of departure leaves a mark because it disrupts familiar patterns and forces reflection long after the moment has passed. Her disappearance also reshapes how she approaches future connections. She becomes more aware of emotional consistency, more sensitive to quiet strength, less impressed by surface level attention. And in that way, your influence extends beyond the relationship itself. You change the emotional standard, not by teaching or correcting, but by embodying it. What's important to understand is that this outcome doesn't depend on whether she comes back. The real shift happened the moment you chose self-respect over reaction. The moment you allowed silence to do the work, words never could. Because walking away with dignity doesn't guarantee reunion, but it guarantees that you're remembered accurately. In the end, your absence becomes your legacy, not as a loss, but as a lesson. A reminder that presence has power only when it's chosen, and that the strongest statement you can make is knowing when to leave. And that's when you realize you didn't disappear to change her, You disappeared to honor yourself,